When an avoidant realizes you're no longer waiting, no longer pleading, no longer giving them the emotional safety net they took for granted, something inside them breaks open in a way even they don't expect. For so long, they relied on the quiet truth that you would always be there, no matter how distant they became, no matter how inconsistent their attention was, no matter how many times they pulled away only to return when it felt safe again. They knew your heart. They counted on your softness. They trusted that you would always be the one to rebuild the bridge after they burned it down. But the moment you stop chasing, their entire internal system gets disrupted. It's like their emotional autopilot shuts off and suddenly they're forced to feel the weight of consequences they've spent years avoiding. This is the moment they feel something they haven't felt in a long time, losing control. Avoidants are built on control. Control of their space, their emotions, their availability, and most importantly, the pace of the connection. They pull back when it gets too close. They return when it feels safe, and they rely on you to stabilize what they keep shaking. So, when your energy shifts, when your messages lose their urgency, when your presence stops orbiting around them, they feel the change before they understand it. It hits them as a subtle discomfort, a small imbalance, like something in the air has shifted. But very quickly, that discomfort grows into a silent internal alarm. This isn't the usual distance. This isn't you giving them space. This is you stepping out of the emotional pattern that kept them comfortable. They don't react the way you might expect. Avoidants don't panic loudly. They don't run after you with dramatic confessions or sudden passion. Their panic is quiet, inward, and private. It shows up in restlessness, in overthinking, in sudden flashes of regret. They try to push away. They start replaying conversations, rereading old texts, scanning for signs they missed, moments where you might have started disconnecting long before they noticed. And the more they look, the more they realize how much you carried without them ever acknowledging it. This is the moment they feel unprepared for, the loss of emotional power. They can't predict your next move anymore. They can't rely on your emotional generosity. They can't depend on your patience to erase the fallout of their distance. For the first time, they sense the possibility that you're truly slipping out of their reach, and that possibility shakes them deeply because it forces a truth they've avoided their whole life. They cared far more than they ever admitted, even to themselves. When the person they thought would always stay finally stops chasing, the avoidance world stops feeling safe, and the shift inside them is not small, it's seismic. Avoidants are hyper attuned to emotional distance, far more than they show or ever admit. While they may appear detached, indifferent, or unfazed on the surface, their internal radar for subtle energetic shifts is incredibly sharp. They notice when something changes long before you voice it, long before you take action, long before you even consciously decide to pull back. They pick up on the tiniest shifts, the softening of your tone, the lighter weight in your words, the sudden absence of enthusiasm that once came so naturally. They feel when your energy no longer leans toward them with the same warmth and certainty. They sense when your responses aren't fueled by hope anymore, but by neutrality, maybe even quiet acceptance. And that shift hits them more deeply than you could ever imagine. For someone who has spent their life trying to manage emotional closeness, this moment is a shock to their system. They have grown accustomed to being the one who pulls away first, the one who creates distance before anyone else can. But when that distance comes from you, when the emotional space widens, not by their choice, but by yours, that's when everything inside them tightens. Their mind goes quiet in a way that feels unsettling. Their chest feels heavy, not from emotion they understand, but from something unfamiliar, something they can't label but instinctively fear. Avoidants are not oblivious, they're observant, hyper aware. And when your emotional pull shifts even slightly, they feel it instantly. It shows up as a small jolt of panic disguised beneath their calm exterior. They may pretend they didn't notice. They may act just as aloof as always. But inside, they're analyzing, noticing patterns, replaying recent conversations, searching for the exact moment they started to lose you. Because in their world, emotional disconnection is danger. It threatens the control they've built their identity around. It forces them into a position they despise Vulnerability, they don't know how to articulate it, but the fear creeps in through quiet whispers. Something's wrong, something's different, they're changing, and I didn't see it coming. And then the realization hits them quietly but hard. They're slipping away, and I can't stop it. This is where the internal conflict begins. For so long, they relied on the fact that you were emotionally invested, that you cared enough to stay even when they made it difficult. They took comfort in the stability you provided. But now your energy has shifted and they feel powerless. The old strategies that once kept them safe don't work in this scenario. Pulling away won't bring you closer. Silence won't draw out your reassurance. Inconsistency won't reignite your effort. All they have now is the growing awareness that you are withdrawing, not out of frustration, but out of clarity. And that clarity terrifies them. Because once an avoidant senses that your heart is no longer reaching for theirs, they realize something they never prepared for. The loss is real, and this time, it's not in their control. They won't show fear openly. Avoidants never do. Even when their chest tightens, even when their thoughts start racing, even when the sinking feeling of something is wrong spreads through their entire body, they won't let it show. Vulnerability to them is exposure, and exposure feels like danger. So instead of expressing the fear rising inside them, they do what they've always done. They hide behind stillness. They shift into a strange mix of withdrawal and observation, a quiet mode where they seem further away, yet paradoxically more tuned in than ever. On the outside, it looks like indifference. On the inside, it's silent panic stitched together with self-protection. They pull back just enough to hide the panic, just enough to keep you from seeing the emotional turbulence they don't know how to manage. They'll respond a little slower, they'll text a little shorter, they'll act a little colder. Not because they don't care, but because they care too much and don't know where to place the intensity. But even as they create this subtle distance, they're watching everything, every shift in your energy, every pause in your replies, every space between your words. Avoidants who once paid attention to protect themselves now pay attention to you because they're trying to figure out how much they've already lost. Your silence becomes louder than their distance ever was. When you don't reach out first, when you don't ask what's wrong, when you don't bridge the space the way you always used to, it sends a shockwave through them. It forces them into a confrontation with their own pattern because for the first time, their emotional withdrawal isn't creating safety, it's creating fear. A fear they don't have the tools to express. They may replay your latest messages, reading between lines that aren't even there. They analyze your tone, your pace, your emotional temperature. Their mind becomes a silent storm. Why aren't they trying anymore? Did I push too far? Are they done? But none of these questions ever leave their mouth. They're trapped in a private dialogue with themselves, trying to decode your silence while pretending it doesn't affect them. And this panic isn't dramatic. It's quiet, heavy, internal. The kind of fear that sits in their stomach and gnaws at them slowly. They don't want to reach out too much because that might reveal their anxiety. They don't want to pull back too far because that might confirm their worst fear, that you're already gone. So they hover in a strange in-between space, distant but alert, withdrawn but attentive, calm on the surface, chaos beneath it. This is the paradox of the avoidant. They watch with intensity while pretending not to care. But your silence, your emotional shift, your lack of pursuit, it dismantles the illusion they're no longer the one in control of the distance. You are. And that quiet panic wrapped in calm, that is their first real sign that they're losing something they never meant to lose in the first place. This is a classic avoidant behavior. When they realize they can't play the same emotional yo-yo game, pulling you in, pushing you away, returning when it felt safe, they go back through texts, memories, and moments, not for nostalgia, but for answers. Avoidants live in their heads far more than they let on, and when they sense they've lost their grip on the connection, their mind becomes a search engine of where did this shift begin. They scroll through your old messages, not just reading the words, but analyzing the tone they once ignored. They revisit conversations where you tried to get closer, moments where you expressed needs, boundaries, or hurt, moments they brushed off or minimized with cold logic. Now suddenly those moments feel different. They carry weight, they carry warning signs they never took seriously. They're looking for the turning point. When did they stop needing me? Not in a healthy, reflective way, not in a sentimental way, but in a fearful, self-protective way. Because for an avoidant, someone not needing them isn't just about independence. It feels like abandonment. And yet, they rarely realize this truth until it's too late. As they scroll through the past, they notice messages you sent with full energy, full heart, full presence. Then, gradually, they see the shift: shorter replies, calmer tones, less emotional effort, less curiosity about them. They see the exact moment when your hope turned into resignation, when your longing turned into acceptance. They see how your emotional warmth cooled, not out of spite, but out of self-respect. That realization hits them harder than any argument ever could. They reread the way you tried to hold the connection together, the times you reached out first, the times you apologized even when you weren't wrong. And they notice how they offered so little in return. They see how your patience stretched until it finally snapped quietly. They notice the jokes you stopped laughing at, the affection you stopped expressing, the vulnerability you slowly closed off. In their mind, these small details turn into alarm bells. How did I miss this happening? But deep down, they didn't miss it. They ignored it. They assumed you would keep trying. They believed you'd always come back. They believed they could keep you close while staying distant. Now, the very memories they avoided confronting become the evidence of their own emotional negligence. This rereading phase is where avoidants face a truth. They can't outrun. Losing you wasn't sudden, it was gradual. You didn't walk away, you slowly stopped reaching. And the moment they realize that, the panic turns into regret. They start wondering why they didn't respond with more care, why they didn't fight harder, why they didn't value the effort you gave so freely. They begin to understand that you weren't asking for too much. You were asking for the bare minimum. And the painful part, they see all of this after you've already detached, after you found peace in letting go, after the emotional current that once pulled you toward them has finally run dry. To them, those old conversations are no longer just messages. They're reminders of everything they lost and everything they never appreciated while they still had the chance. Avoidants rarely appreciate love in the moment. They appreciate it when it's gone, when your warmth was always there, when your messages carried care, when your presence felt steady. They didn't know how to absorb it. They felt pressured by the intimacy, overwhelmed by the closeness, threatened by the emotional responsibility. So instead of embracing the safety you offered, they labeled your love as too much, your needs as demanding, your consistency as pressure. But the moment that love is no longer present, the moment your energy stops reaching for them, something happens inside them that they never expect. They suddenly notice your value with painful clarity. This clarity doesn't arrive gently. It crashes into them. It exposes every moment they took your kindness for granted. It confronts them with the reality that someone who cared deeply, someone who showed up with emotional intention, has now slipped out of their grasp. Your consistency, empathy, effort, all the things they dismiss, now appear as rare, irreplaceable, and safe. And that realization, it stings. Avoidants often move through relationships with a quiet confidence that the other person will always be there. They rely on your softness, your patience, your emotional strength, even while pretending they don't need it. They assume your support will outlast their distance. But once you stop offering that support, once you detach, not in anger, but in acceptance, the entire dynamic changes. What used to feel overwhelming now feels like a loss. What used to feel suffocating now feels like comfort. They can no longer reach. Suddenly, they remember the way you understood them when they didn't explain. They remember the way you stayed even when they didn't ask. They remember the way your presence made their world feel less chaotic. They remember how easy it was to take you for granted until the moment you stopped showing up. Avoidants don't process love through emotional expression. They process it through absence. They don't see your value through closeness. They see it through distance. And once that distance appears, their mind begins replaying everything with a different lens, one filled with regret, longing, and clarity. Things they once dismissed now feel like luxuries. Your patience, your emotional availability, your understanding during their withdrawal, your willingness to communicate, your openness to connection. These were not burdens. These were gifts. But they only realized that now, when the gifts are no longer offered, this painful clarity forces them into an emotional confrontation they've avoided their whole life because your absence highlights something they never wanted to acknowledge. They were cared for in a way they didn't know how to receive. And losing that care feels like losing a part of their life that was safer than they allowed themselves to admit. And the sting, it lingers. Not because you hurt them, but because they finally see what they lost. And they realize it was their own fear, not your love, that pushed it away. They won't chase dramatically. That's not how avoidants operate. Grand gestures feel threatening to them too, exposing, too raw. Instead, when they sense they're losing you, really losing you, they shift into something far more subtle, almost invisible to anyone who doesn't understand avoidant patterns. They start testing the waters, not with commitment, not with vulnerability, but with tiny, careful signals meant to check if the door is still open. It might come through a random check-in that feels strangely out of place, a message that arrives at an odd hour, short and casual, but loaded with hidden meaning. Something like, just checking in, hope everything's good. It sounds harmless. It sounds loud. But beneath the surface, it's them asking a deeper question. They're too afraid to voice. Are you still there? Do I still matter to you? Then there's the vague, non-committal, hey, how have you been? The phrase avoidants use when they want closeness without admitting it. They want conversation, but they need it to feel safe, so they choose the most neutral words possible. To them, this tiny outreach feels vulnerable. It feels like a risk. It feels like stepping on a frozen lake and hoping it doesn't crack beneath them. They'll also start liking your stories again, sometimes immediately after you post, sometimes hours later when it feels less obvious. It's not about the content, it's about checking your presence, testing your reaction, seeing if you notice. These little interactions are their way of softly knocking on the door without actually walking in. If you engage, they take it as a sign that they haven't lost you completely. If you ignore it, the panic inside them deepens. And then come the pointless questions. Small, unnecessary, almost silly inquiries meant to spark conversation without revealing their true intention. They might ask about a show you once mentioned, a song you posted months ago, or something trivial like, hey, do you remember the name of that place we talked about? They don't care about the answer. What they want is your energy, your attention, your signal that they still have a place in your life. To anyone else, these actions would seem insignificant, but for an avoidant, they're monumental. They are the equivalent of emotional outreach. It's their version of saying, I'm trying, but I don't know how to do this directly. It's their quiet way of saying, don't be gone yet. Because deep down, they feel the shift. They feel the distance. They feel the loss of the emotional certainty they once depended on. And even though they can't bring themselves to chase openly, their subtle attempts reveal the truth they've spent so long running from. They don't want to lose you, not completely, not permanently. These small signals, these cautious attempts at reconnection, are their way of reaching out without risking rejection. And in their world, where vulnerability feels dangerous, this is the bravest form of reaching out they know. When you stop playing the game, their old strategies collapse. For so long, avoidance relied on predictable patterns, patterns that kept them comfortable, guarded, and in control. Distance was their shield. Silence was their weapon. And consistency was their emotional safety net. These tactics weren't random. They were survival mechanisms, shaped by years of avoiding vulnerability. And every time they used them, they worked. They created just enough space to feel safe, just enough unpredictability to keep you reaching, just enough emotional fog to maintain control of the connection. But now everything has changed. Distance doesn't pull you in anymore. The space they once used to regain power now becomes the space where you find peace, where you breathe, where you realize you don't have to hold the connection together alone. Instead of rushing back to reassure them, you stay still. And that stillness is something they're not prepared for, because your stillness shows them the one thing they never expected. You're no longer emotionally dependent on their presence. Silence doesn't scare you anymore. In the past, their silence made you anxious. It made you overthink. It made you chase. But now, their silence gives you clarity. It confirms the truth you've slowly accepted. If someone wants to stay, they don't make you guess. Now their silence doesn't create fear. It creates freedom. And this reversal leaves them completely disarmed. Inconsistency doesn't destabilize you anymore. The hot and cold cycle they once used to control the emotional temperature now falls flat. You're no longer shaken by their unpredictable affection. You don't cling to crumbs. You don't romanticize mixed signals. You've outgrown the chaos they created. And instead of pulling you closer, their inconsistency starts pushing you farther away, something they never intended yet can't stop. This terrifies them because for once you hold the power they used to have. Avoidants have built their entire emotional structure around the belief that intimacy can only hurt if you let someone get too close. So they maintain control by staying one step back, always slightly unreachable, always slightly detached. But when their shields stop working, when their distance stops affecting you, when their silence stops provoking you, when their inconsistency stops confusing you, they lose the only protection they ever trusted. For the first time, you are the one who feels steady, grounded, and emotionally independent, and they are the one who feels uncertain, anxious, and unbalanced. This role reversal forces them to confront something they've spent years avoiding: the emotional consequences of their behavior. They begin to understand, slowly and painfully, that the walls they built didn't just keep them safe, they kept them alone. And now that those walls no longer affect you, they can't hide behind them anymore. Their usual emotional shields stop working, not because you punished them, but because you healed, because you grew, because you stopped participating in a dynamic that drained your spirit. And nothing terrifies an avoidant more than realizing the control they relied on is gone. And they have no idea how to navigate connection without it. Avoidants don't change because they feel ready. They don't wake up one morning and suddenly desire closeness, consistency, or vulnerability. Their internal wiring doesn't shift from fear to openness just because time passes. Avoidants change when reality forces them to. When the emotional landscape they once controlled collapses beneath them. When they realize that the very distance they used for protection is now the reason they're losing someone who mattered far more than they ever admitted. And that's what your boundary becomes: the lesson they can't run from, the turning point they didn't choose but can no longer avoid. Your boundary becomes the moment their internal story collapses. For so long, they believed you would always be there. They believed they could withdraw, come back, disappear, reappear, and you would always meet them with the same open heart. They believed their fear of intimacy justified their inconsistency. But when your boundary arrives, calm, steady, non-reactive, it shocks them because it's not an argument. It's not a threat. It's not emotional pleading. It's clarity. And clarity is something they can't outrun. Your distance becomes the mirror they can't avoid. In that space, they finally see themselves clearly. They see how their silence felt like rejection to you. They see how their mixed signals became emotional exhaustion. They see the weight you carry trying to love someone who kept you at arm's length. And what they once labeled as pressure suddenly reveals itself as devotion. What they once called too much now looks like effort they never reciprocated. Without your presence cushioning their fear, they finally confront the truth of their behavior, and it hurts in a way they didn't expect. Inside them, something subtle but powerful shifts. The fear of intimacy, the fear of closeness, the fear of emotional exposure, these fears have guided their entire relational life. But now, a new fear rises, stronger and sharper: the fear of losing you. This fear hits differently. It doesn't push them away. It pulls them forward. For the first time, connection feels safer than losing you. Not because they've become cured, not because their attachment suddenly transformed, but because the emotional cost of staying distant finally outweighs the cost of getting close. They start to realize that losing you means losing the one person who saw through their walls, the one person who offered care without demanding perfection, the one person who loved them in a language they never learned to speak. This fear doesn't magically fix them, but it disarms them. It softens the edges of their defenses. It makes them reconsider what intimacy actually means. They start asking questions they never asked before. What if closeness isn't danger? What if losing them is worse than being vulnerable? What if connection could feel like safety, not suffocation? These questions are the cracks in the armor they've worn for years, and through those cracks, something unexpected finally enters: the possibility of real connection. Because for the first time in their life, the fear of losing you overpowers the fear of being close to you, and that is where their transformation begins. When an avoidant realizes they can't play with you anymore, they finally have to face themselves. Not you, not the relationship themselves. And that's the moment everything shifts. Their patterns, their awareness, their behavior. For years, avoidants have relied on emotional distance, withdrawal, and subtle manipulation of closeness to feel safe. They've mastered the art of avoidance, of keeping connection at arm's length while still maintaining the illusion of intimacy. But when you finally step back, when you stop chasing, when you stop accommodating their fear, with your patience and your consistency, the dynamics that once kept them comfortable crumble. Suddenly, the reflection staring back at them is not the person they can manipulate or test. It's themselves. It's the fear they've hidden behind, the walls they've built, the patterns they've relied on for so long, and for the first time, they have to reckon with it. This confrontation is uncomfortable, even painful, because it bypasses the usual distractions. There's no arguing, no pleading, no emotional exhaustion to diffuse the reality. Instead, your absence acts like a mirror. It shows them what they've been avoiding, the impact of their behavior, the gaps in their care, the moments they chose self-protection over connection. They start seeing themselves with painful clarity, noticing how many chances they took for granted, how many gestures of love they overlooked, how much patience you extended while they remained emotionally distant. And unlike before, they can't push this awareness aside with busyness, withdrawal, or distractions. It stares them in the face, unavoidable and undeniable. And the shift that follows is subtle but profound. Their patterns, the distance, the games, the avoidance start to feel cumbersome. Their awareness, the knowledge that you could walk away and not return, becomes a catalyst for reflection. Their behavior, the ways they reach out, the small tests, the hesitation begins to change, not because they suddenly want to, but because the consequences of their choices are now unavoidable. They see that losing you would mean losing a connection that was authentic, steady, and rare. They feel a quiet, intense recognition that their fear of intimacy has limited them far more than their independence has protected them. This realization does not come from you trying to fix them, chasing them, or fighting for them. It comes from the one act of power you hold that they cannot control: your decision to stop accommodating the patterns that enabled their avoidance. It is your calm, consistent boundary, your refusal to participate in emotional games, and your choice to step back that forces their inner reflection. You become the catalyst for their self-confrontation, not by aggression or argument, but by your absence. And in that space, they are left with themselves, their fear, their defense mechanisms, their avoidance, and their desire for connection all collide. This is where transformation begins, not because you changed them, but because you finally stopped, and they could no longer hide from the truth of who they are.